guys, so today I'm going to take you through the steps of sewing Mccalls M8091. So yeah, let me know what you thought and let's get started.
So these are all the pieces you're going to need. There's 20 different pieces in total. You might not need them all, for example, if you're not doing the pockets, but just make sure you pay attention to each pattern piece. It will say directly on it how many you need to cut out of each piece. So you will need piece 9. I'm doing version C, so these are the pieces I'm using. Piece 15. I'm not doing the pockets, so. Piece 5. And 6. Some of these do need interfacing as well, so make sure you take note of that. 5 and 6 definitely do need interfacing. 8. So yeah, there's 4 of these cut out. So make sure you are, just like I said, checking to see how much you need of everything. So the first thing we're going to do, so we're going to be attaching pattern pieces 1 and 2. So you should have cut out 2 of pattern piece 1 and 2 of pattern piece 2, and we're going to attach them so that we'll end up with 2 pieces instead of 4. So you should have transferred your notches so that you know where to line things up. So you can see on your pattern pieces where the notches are, which just gives you an idea of where things should line up. So we'll just pin at the notches. And then we'll do the same thing for the other 2 identical pieces, because like I said, we should have cut out 4 total pieces, and then we'll end up with 2. So, do the exact same thing with these pieces. So we're going to be stitching at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end.
Okay, so just like I said, we're going to sew at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to do the same thing on the other side. And remember to back stitch.
Okay, so now we're going to attach our pieces 3 and 4. 3 is your bodice back, 4 is your side back, and 3 should have been cut on a full, so you should only have 1. And then we're going to attach 1 pattern piece 4 to each side of pattern piece 3. So we're attaching the side back to the back. And again, you should have transferred your notches so that you know where to attach pieces 4 to piece 3. And so I'm just going to attach both of my pattern pieces onto pattern piece 3 at once so that I can just sew them quickly at the sewing machine instead of pinning one side and then coming back to pin the other side after I've sewn already. Hopefully that makes sense. And just matching up the notches here. Pin one side, and then I'll pin the other side. So then we're just going to sew along this long edge here and this edge, both at 5/8.
So at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on this side, and then we'll do the same on the other side. Okay, so then what we're going to do, so this is the piece we just sewed. We've just sewn together these pieces onto the center back. And then we're going to take our piece that had the bodice front and the bodice side, which is this piece. Or sorry, it has the bodice side and the bodice back, and we're going to attach both of these, because we have 2 of them, on to the piece we were just sewing. So we're going to match up our notches. This one goes here. So we have the double notch. You should have the double notch here and here. So we're just going to match those up.
So now we're just going to be attaching our front pieces and our back pieces of the bodice. It's just all the pieces we've just finished sewing. So now we're going to end up with one long piece, and all of our bodice pieces should be attached, except for our bands. And I'm just going to do what I did before. Just going to pin both sides at once and then sew them both at once. So I'm sure you guys know by now, we're sewing at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on this side, and we'll do the same on the other side. I'm pretty sure this entire pattern is using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so if I forget to mention it, just remember that's what it is. Remember to back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and then yeah, just make sure you do the same with the other side. And then I've just attached my pieces for 5 and 6, pattern pieces 5 and 6 at the short ends. I had a video, but I don't know what happened to it. It must have gotten deleted. But yeah, you should end up with one long piece once you attach. So it's 3 pieces total that are getting attached together. Again, sewing at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and just stitching both sides similar to the way we did. We attached the sides to the back piece of the bodice.
So we have our long bodice piece here, and you should be pressing all your seams as we go along. So now what we're going to do is take the front and back band that we just stitched, and we're going to match up the bottom of the band to the top of the bodice, just making sure to match up your notches, and we're doing right sides facing. So just find your notches that you should have transferred when you were cutting out your pieces, and just pin. At the notch before just to make sure everything's lining up. And then we're going to stitch along this whole length at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Stitching along the full length of the bodice at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, remembering to backstitch at the beginning and the end. So before we pressed our seam allowances opened, as you can see here, this time we are going to actually press our seam allowances up towards the band. So go ahead and give your seam a press, and then I'll show you what to do next. Okay, so I have my shoulder pieces here, my shoulder strap, and you should have cut out 4, and we're just going to fold them in half lengthwise, and then sew all along the length at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, pivot at the corner and sew to this edge, and we're leaving this edge raw so that we can turn the strap inside out, and so we're going to do that with all 4 pieces. Turn them right sides out and give them a press. Oh, and don't forget to trim your seam allowances. Okay, so like I said, we're sewing along the entire length of the straps at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and back stitching at the beginning and the end. And we're going to stop when we get to this corner here and pivot. And then just sew all the way to the edge. So we have the strap here, and again, making sure we leave this raw edge open so that we can turn it right side out, and then just do the exact same thing with the other strap. Okay, so I've pressed all 4 of my straps, and now what you're going to do is pin them. You should have marked large and small circles on the wrong side of your bands. Well, and so you're just going to match up and pin a strap to each marking. So I've made some markings here. So my strap needs to be between the 2 markings that I've made. We'll just go ahead and do that with all 4 straps, and then we're going to baste our straps along the raw edge. Okay, so as you can see, I've pinned my straps onto my bodice, matching up the markings where I had the large circle and small circle, which you should have transferred from your pattern pieces 5 and 6. See the large circle and the small circle. That's where you're going to pin your straps and baste along the raw edges. Okay, so like I said, we're just basting all 4 straps onto our bodice. And now we're going to take our uninterfaced front and back bands. So here's my back band and my 2 front pieces. So again, making sure that you're grabbing the ones that are not interfaced. We're going to pin them together at the notches, right sides facing. On both sides of the back band. And then we're just going to be stitching along this edge on both sides with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to take our band pieces that have the interfacing, and we're going to stitch them together just like we did. Match up our notches and pin, right sides facing. Okay, so I have my band pieces, just the ones that are interfaced this time, and we're pinning them exactly like we did with the uninterfaced pieces, and we're stitching along these edges at 5/8 of an inch seam allowances, and then I'll show you what to do next. I band facings together just like I did before. And we're going to take the bottom edge. So on the shorter band piece here where it curves up, you're going to the bottom, and we're going to fold in 1/2 an inch, and then we're going to cut this 1/4 inch. So we're going to fold it and press it with 1/2 an inch, and then trim it down to 1/4 inch. Okay, so I've pressed up 1/2 an inch and then trimmed it down to 1/4 inch. I've also pressed opened my seams. And we're just going to pin it right sides facing to the raw upper edge of our bodice. So now we're just going to stitch all along the entire length of the bodice at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. The entire length at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure your straps are down and out of the way. Sometimes they might get pushed up, and we really don't want to accidentally sew them into our seam because then we'd have to pick out the seam and it would just be annoying. So just be careful of that. So now what we're going to do is understitch. So first, we're going to fold our facing up away from the bodice. And we're going to press the seam allowance up towards the facing. And then after we press it, we're going to trim it and then understitch, which means we're just sewing on the top, on the So we're just going to understitch, which means we're going to press the seam allowance up towards the facing. We're going to trim it, and then we're going to sew on the right side, just very, very small distance from the seam, all along the edge, like all along the length of the facing. Okay, so I've pressed my seam allowances up towards the facing and clipped the curves, as you can see, being careful not to cut the threads. And then I trimmed this down by about half, so probably about 1/4 of an inch. And so now we're going to understitch. So we have to stitch very close to the seam in order to make sure we're actually catching the seam allowance here. You can kind of use your fingers to feel and make sure that the seam allowance is still facing the facing. So what the understitching does is it just helps the facing stay on the inside of the garment, so it's not sort of peeking through or accidentally coming to the out to the right side. I think it's just one of those many small details that it's not the end of the world if you don't do it, but if you don't, I feel like it's a lot easier to tell that it's homemade. that we have the understitching done, we're going to fold the facing down so that it covers this stitching line here, just like that, and we're going to pin it, and then we will sew it down. Okay, so I've understitched, as you can, I don't know if you can see it, you can sort of see the stitching line, and then I've pressed my facing down to the inside, and then what we're going to do is pin, making sure your straps are up and out of the way. We're going to pin all along the seam line because we're going to stitch in the ditch, which just means we're stitching right in that seam allowance. And what that does is make the stitching invisible on the right side of the garment, because the needle should be going right in the middle, like of these two seams. And we just need to make sure that it will be catching this edge. So we'll just pin right in the ditch where we're going to be stitching. And as you can see, it does catch it. So we're just going to pin all along the facing on the right side, and then we'll be stitching. Okay, so as you can see, I've pinned all along the length of this seam here, and I've made sure that it's catching the edge of the facing. And so we're just going to stitch in the ditch like I said. I like to just lower the needle with my hand just to make sure it's going right in that seam. Slow it down. What I try to do rather than watching the needle is I make sure this seam is going directly in the center of the foot. Remember to backstitch at the end. And as you can see, it did catch the back of the band. It's not perfect, but I think it's pretty good. Okay, so we have our finished bodice here, well, mostly finished, and then we have our uninterfaced midriff, so that's piece 9, and you should have transferred your markings from your pattern pieces. I added pins for some of the markings, but first we're going to match our notches, right sides facing to the bottom of the bodice. So just go ahead and pin.
Okay, so now we're just going to attach our midriff piece, which is pattern piece 9, to the bottom raw edge of our bodice, right sides facing. Just make sure you match up your notches and pin all along the entire length of your bodice. So this piece, just make sure you're using your midriff that is not interfaced, because you should have one interfaced and one not. We're attaching the uninterfaced piece first. Okay, so I already went ahead and I folded the bottom edge of my midriff in a 1/2 inch. I gave it a press, and then I trimmed it down by a 1/4 of an inch, just like we did before with the top band. And now I'm going to pin the right side of this to the wrong side of the bodice, just at the seam allowance that we have here. And I'm actually going to make sure when I'm sewing that the uninterfaced midriff piece is pushed up away towards the bodice, because we don't want to accidentally stitch through anywhere that we don't mean to, because right now we're only stitching through the interfaced midriff and the seam allowance that was here from before. So yeah, we don't want to be sewing on this piece here, just this. Like, we're going to be folding it down like this, and it's going to just create a nice finish, I guess, and some more stability in the midriff piece. So yeah, just like I said, we're folding that uninterfaced midriff piece up towards the bodice while we sew. Sorry, I know some of this filming and audio is not lined up properly, so it's awkward. When I was filming, I was doing the voice at the same time, but my computer deleted a bunch of the voice recordings that I had, so now I'm having to go back and do the voice recording after the fact. So if it doesn't seem like things are quite lined up with the video and audio, that's why. Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and pin all along this entire length, and we're going to stitch it very similar to the way we did the uninterfaced midriff. So we're pinning the raw edge. The folded edge should not be what you are pinning down and what you are stitching down. Okay, so we're just going to put our bodice aside for now, and now we're going to work on our skirt. So we have quite a few pieces here, and we're just going to attach pieces 10 and 11 with right sides facing. So 10 is the skirt front, and 11 is the skirt side front. So just make sure you're matching up your notches. So you're attaching, you can see one side of the skirt that we're attaching is more straight, and one side is curved. See this curved line here? So just make sure you're attaching everything on the correct side. But again, if you're matching up your notches, you shouldn't have anything to worry about. So we're going to pin all along the length for all 4 pieces, and then we're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance for both pieces. Okay, so we're doing our usual 5/8 inch seam allowance for both sides of our skirt fronts. Normally the next step after this would be to work on your pocket, but I didn't want the pocket, so I'm skipping that step. But just make sure you do that next if you are including a pocket. So now we have our finished piece here, and I've pressed my seam allowance, and you should be finishing all your seams whichever way you like, with a serger or pinking shears. And the next step is to take out your piece 13, which should have been cut on a fold, and 13 is the skirt back, and you should have cut out 2 pieces for 14, and we're going to attach 1 14 onto either side of piece 13. So you should have 3 pieces, and we'll end up with 1. So just make sure you match up your notches and markings. And then we're going to press our seams in towards the center. So you'll be pressing the seams in towards piece 13. And as usual, once you're done sewing, just make sure you go back and finish your seams. Yeah. So as I've mentioned, we're doing a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. We're going to do this on both sides because we've pinned on both piece 14s onto our piece 13. Okay, so the next step will be to stitch your skirt front to your skirt back at the side seams. Just making sure you're matching up your notches, and of course it's right sides facing. And just make sure everything's right side up. So we're just going to stitch both side seams at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then make sure after that you press and finish your seams. So now we have our skirt piece all finished here, and we're going to attach it to our bodice. So we're attaching our skirt to the midriff facing that is not interfaced. So make sure you push the interfaced midriff out of the way and just pin all along this raw edge. Just match up your notches and place the squares at the side seams. We're going to baste this in place and then press the seam towards the midriff. We're just going to sew all along the entire length of the bottom of the bodice and the top of the skirt. Just going to make sure we're not catching the interfaced midriff. What you have should look something like this. As you can see, I've pressed my seam allowance up towards the midriff, and then I'm going to fold the interfaced piece down, making sure our folded edge is pressed inwards. So you shouldn't have any raw fabric here. Okay, so as you can see, we're going to stitch in the ditch just like we did up here. Same thing, just a different spot. And just make sure everything will catch when you pin in the ditch. So pin in the ditch first. Okay, so now that we've sewn our midriff onto our seam allowance, our interface midriff piece, we're going to stitch in the ditch just like we did before. One thing I'll tell you is that I did end up folding. We had the folded edge of the midriff. I actually ended up folding it more. So before we had 1/4 inch there that was left after we folded 1/2 inch, trimmed it down 1/4 inch. I ended up folding more up because I noticed it was not, there was too much extra fabric. So then if I left it that way, when I went to sew, it wouldn't do anything really. It would just end up sewing down the midriff, but then the raw edge would be able to come loose and it just wouldn't look nice and it wouldn't look finished. Hopefully that makes sense and you know what I'm talking about, but it's just something to be aware of when you're sewing this dress. I'm not sure what caused it. I was pretty careful cutting out my pieces, so I don't think I've cut anything wrong, and I've been stitching according to their seam allowance guidelines, so I'm not really sure why it didn't quite line up for me, but it's just something to be aware of. Yeah, so as you can see, it can just easily it would come undone like this, because this is where the stitching would be, and then we would just have this floppy piece of fabric. So I just went back and pressed it with a bigger amount of fabric on the inside of the fold, so that now when I go ahead and stitch, my stitches will be much closer to that fold, so that it can't come unfolded. I'm just going to do exactly what we did before. Just make sure the needle's right in the ditch there and sew all along the length. Back stitching at the beginning and the end. Okay, so now what we're going to do is attach our placket to the front of the dress. You should have two plackets. They're both interfaced, and it's very similar to what we've been doing. We're folding in a 1/2 inch on the one long edge, and then we're trimming it down to 1/4 inch, and then we're going to pin the raw edge onto the raw edge of the dress, the front opening of the dress, and that's where our buttonholes are eventually going to be attached. Our buttons and our buttonholes are going to go on these plackets. So you're doing the same thing on both sides of the dress. So make sure you're doing all these steps twice for either side. And then, yeah, just make sure you're matching up your notches, which you guys know by now. Okay, so now we're just going to stitch along the entire lengths of our plackets on both sides of the dress. Just make sure your straps are out of the way here. Just the same as for everything else, it's 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And just make sure you do the same on both sides. So on this placket and on the other placket. Okay, so now that the placket's sewn on, I've pressed the seam allowance towards the placket. I also went ahead and did what we've been doing, folded this over a 1/2 inch and pressed it, and then trimmed it down 1/4 inch, and now I'm going to stitch along this short edge here. On the top of the placket and at the bottom, so the top of the dress and the bottom of the dress. We're going to do that for both plackets, making sure we catch this folded edge, and then we're going to flip it right sides out, and that should end up like this. This is where we're going to have our buttons or buttonholes, depending on what side of the dress you're looking at. So like I said, we're just going to fold this in half, right sides facing. We're just going to stitch along this short edge. And I'm just going pretty close to the edge here. But actually you should do 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm just doing a shorter one because I want my dress a bit longer. So once you've right side outed your both plackets and give it a press, then you'll need to stitch in the ditch one more time on both sides, and then attach your buttonholes and your buttons. You should have transferred markings from your pattern pieces for that, and then all that's left is to hem the dress and you're done. So thanks for watching, and leave a comment and let me know what you thought and if you made the dress. Thanks, bye.